Okay, while I'm talking, I'll go ahead and put this up for you. If you're interested in following along on these slides, you can just scan this. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that, or maybe a minute. So I always like to begin by asking questions so I have an idea who's in front of me, so I can kind of tailor what I'm talking to the right levels, right? So let's start with, are there developers in the room? Hardcore open source developers or business developers? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, architects? All the developers, you should put your hand back up because it's basically what you want to be too, right? Managers? There's always a few. What are you doing here? So it's like the free pizza, I guess, right? That's pretty much it, I guess. Is anybody here working with open source in some form or in their organization? So you have an idea what it is, roughly, some of you. All right. So everybody got this? Go back here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share an online, free, hands-on workshop. You can go home, you can do this on any machine. As you've seen on your phone, if you scan that thing, this is scalable slides, so you can show your boss in the lift on the way up to the 5th floor. It scales to any kind of device, and everything on here is free and available. You can download it and use it. You can see the disclaimer here because I actually had a workshop I did in Boston with this a couple weeks ago, and in the sense of trying to get this done on time, I had to stop testing things like Windows because you can't even connect them to a beamer to get it to work sometimes, right? And Windows is just a pain in the butt to get to work with everything. So the cop-out there is that we're going to do containers for anybody that's using something that isn't supported by the open source build. If you don't want to go that far, there's 2 paths for everything that happens here. You can either go into a container-based something, or does anybody here know what a container is? All of you, right? I hope, except for the managers. All right. So if you do the container stuff, that's the fallback that works on everything. You'll notice that we're using Podman here. Who here is a Docker fan? Really? Why? just checking. If you like Docker, that's fine too. Most of this stuff will work the same. Podman, you can put an alias on it and call it Docker, right? It's basically the same thing because everything's backed by an open standard, open container initiative. So both of them are written to a container standard, right? That's the good stuff about open source. The other ones, if you're hardcore, you can build it all, and it's all designed to run locally on your machine. So it works on this one with only 16 gigabytes of RAM, so that's pretty cheesy, right? It should work on everybody's stuff. Do realize we're talking about monitoring and observability. Do you know the difference? Anybody here an SRE? Anybody know what that is? Hey, there's one in the back. How long you been doing it?
Essentially DBA, but I've got an SRE.
You got an SRE title. Okay, how long you been doing it?
I've been doing DBA for 6 years, 7.
Okay. Well, it sounds like he's leaning on the DBA and not so interested in the SRE part. So site reliability engineers is probably one of the hardest jobs in IT. It's just flat out hard, right? These are the ones that have to carry the beepers at Christmas time. These are maybe you have on-call duty too. So you've been doing it for, yeah, see? For 6 years you've been doing this, but just for the DB? Or for the whole platform?
12 years.
Oh my God. So this is the guy you buy beers tonight, right? This guy's got the hardest job out there. I'm not kidding. What happened? Maybe went to sleep. Yeah, that's just me.
Panic too early.
No worries. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the first little bit of the workshop. I'm going to show you the layout, show you how it works. You can go home and do this, right? It doesn't really matter, and I always tell people, it doesn't matter how far I get in this. So if you want me to talk, she's like before we started, talk a half hour, talk 40 minutes, I don't care. You know, I can go a long time. There's 8 or 9 labs in this thing if you want to go through all of them, but we're not going to do that. But what I'm going to try and do is get through the first chapter so you get an introduction to what Prometheus is, what observability is a little bit, kind of an idea where all this stuff goes and what it's about. And then if we have enough time at the end, I've got bits and pieces of this workshop running on my laptop so we can actually look at it, right? So you can see it and see what Prometheus looks like, and we can do a query or two. The DBA will love this, right? All right, so when you get to this thing, if you follow that URL or whatever, and if you have any trouble with this stuff, I'm very easy to find online. Normally I list my name, but I didn't do it on this because this is a workshop. But at the end of every chapter, my name and contact details are in there. So you can always find me to ask questions. Please do. If you have anything you want to talk about that we talk about tonight or whatever, just refer to this meetup. I meet a lot of people doing this, so I might not remember who you are, but I will remember if you put a connection in it with the story. And I react to everything eventually. All right? So the idea here, when you get here, if you hit M, you get a table of contents, right? Like a menu on the side. So you can see here that the whole thing is, if you can see that, I don't know, you guys might have a little bit of trouble with that, but it lists all the labs out, right? So lab 1, introduction, installing Prometheus, introduction, we'll walk through some of this stuff. The ones that aren't done are here in the middle yet, but they're coming. So if you keep coming back, it's going to keep releasing. I'm halfway through the next one already. I continue to work on this every day. It's really fun stuff. If you go to the right, or we just push the button, you're going to see that you get a little idea how to navigate through this stuff because it's online. And then I'm going to turn it on if I want to use it. Maybe not. And then some of the guidelines of what this text and stuff means and what it looks like and what's code. And then you get an introduction to Prometheus and you click on this and you dive right into the first lab. We'll do that in a second, right? And then if you go to the next one is installing Prometheus. And they're also chained, so when you get to the end of the first one, it'll jump you right to the next one and so on. But you might want to come back here and go to look at something specific. We're going to have an introduction to the query language, because anytime you're using a metrics gathering system, it's basically a time series database. It's got a bunch of information in it. You got to be able to query it. So we're going to learn about the query language. Then we're going to look at how to actually get hands-on and do basic queries. I'm going to show you one or two. That's as far as we're going tonight. This is a whole chapter full of it. And then you have advanced queries, where you do really complicated stuff like histograms, and you might have heard about that in math courses back at university, right? I had to look at it again. I was like, what is this? How do you relabel stuff? So you might get a lot of systems out there that you're monitoring at one point in time, and then you're getting duplicate things that are coming in, and you can merge them, and you can filter stuff out, and we'll explain a little bit how that works. And then I have a whole bonus section here. This is a dashboarding with a open source project called Perseus. This is basically started in reaction to, anybody here know Grafana? So that was like the standard database or dashboarding default open source, whatever that everybody uses. They changed their license a little bit. They tweaked it, and they said, yeah, we're still Apache, and you're still allowed to use it and stuff, but if you do anything to it, you have to contribute that code back, which is kind of a problem for a lot of companies that put something like that in their product and don't want to release all this other stuff in their product, right? So not everybody's really happy about that. So what does the open source community do? You know, they build something new. And they take all the learnings they had from when they were using Grafana and they put it into this to make it better, basically. So there's about 6 labs in here where you build dashboards from scratch. So the idea is to integrate this a little bit more into the Prometheus, so you're also querying the actual demo projects that you start up in here that we'll look at. And then what's not done, as you can see, is they have the ability to do service discovery. So anybody that uses Kubernetes or cloud-based anything, yeah, you need to be able to discover services, not constantly list the ones that are out there, right, in the configuration file. In the old days, you knew what was in your data center. If you were going to expand something, you bought new servers, put new stuff in a rack, and you changed the configuration file. That's not really very handy when you have millions of things spinning up all the time, right? So you want to be able to use service discovery stuff. And you have instrumentation. So applications out there want to be able to share certain kind of metrics, usually business metrics. A lot of the discovery and the auto libraries and things, they will expose metrics from applications or languages or whatever it is out there, but they tend to do kind of standard stuff. So it won't be really specific stuff. And then we'll also do some stuff where we play around on Kubernetes with it, right, deploying it on there. So you've already got a preview if you've done the container side, so you're basically doing it already. And then at the end here, we talk about monitoring at scale. If I ever come back and we do like a part 2 of this or something, this would be the one I'd present, because you're going to see at the beginning, it's really fun to talk about one version of this, but what do you do when it turns into monitoring, you know, a whole cloud thing or multiple clouds or thousands of instances of stuff? That's hard. That's super hard. Anybody here seen the bill from their company for monitoring? Yeah, that's a thing. You know, I could tell you some stories about some stuff during the pandemic that blew up in the States, for example, DoorDash, those delivery sites and stuff. Yeah, everybody started wanting deliveries, right? It wasn't a problem for them to spin up their infrastructure. It was a problem to monitor that infrastructure that went like this, right? It's a big deal. And then you get to the end. Oh, there you go. See, there's me. So that's kind of at the end of every chapter. You're going to see something like this, right? And so we'll go back and we'll just do the first one. Give you kind of an idea what it looks like. So, introduction to Prometheus. Every lab starts with a goal, right? You got to figure out what you're going to do. It's kind of like teaching. It's like school. Don't worry, there's no test. But this is what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at the project and kind of get an understanding of what this stuff is, right? So what is this? Prometheus started out as an open source project from people at SoundCloud. Anybody know what that is? Only the old people are doing this. it's quite a ways back, right? I think the first commit was in 2012. It wasn't that far back. But it's under the umbrella of the CNCF. Do you know what that is? Cloud Native Computing Foundation, right? That's a big organization that's sort of like works together with the Linux Foundation, where they host projects, host events, and they do an awful lot of stuff in the cloud space. So it's a lot of monitoring, tracing, that kind of stuff. This is a graduated project. There's not a whole lot of those, but it's been around for a while, which means it's being used in all kinds of organizations. Now, we're gonna go all the way back to the beginning and take a look at what we're even talking about, right? So you're talking about data points, collecting them, and doing something with them, right? Getting value out of them. You have systems deployed, apps deployed, all this kind of stuff. What do you do with that kind of stuff? And the best way to think about this is to think about bees, flowers, and a beehive, right? Very simplistic. I'm always looking for really simple examples. I think everybody knows how that works, right? You have flowers out in the field that have nectar. Those are your apps out there, or your systems out there, right? You want to go out there and you want to gather this data. You want to get the nectar and bring it back. So you have to figure out something like a bee to go out there and target these things. Bees got to know how to find them. You know, how bees do it is sort of what Prometheus also does, except for it doesn't have wings. And it's got to transport what it gathers back to the hive, right? Back to the time series database that it's using. And it has to store this stuff. And it has to store it in such a way in a model that we know how to access that, right? Provide a query language that can access that. And by having a query language, we can now write rules about what we find in this thing. And we can write rules that'll trigger things like alerts, or put things on dashboards and make gauges go like this when it gets full, right? Things like that. So that's the idea here. The transportation is getting it back to the time series database, right? Got to figure out how to target these things. You're either going to physically say that machine has to be targeted, that app, that endpoint somewhere out there has to be targeted, or you're going to use the auto discovery stuff that'll just be scanning your Kubernetes stuff for anything new that gets spun up if we're getting really popular with our applications. And then I already discussed a little bit about the visualization of that, right? So you've put this into a time series database. That's very different from, what database are you using?
A SQL Server, MySQL.
Yeah, so that's like standard, right? Data. You can look at it, everybody gets that. Time series is a whole other monster. We'll get to that in a minute. I mean, you have to think about, you're constantly monitoring a flow of something, but you don't want all of it. That just doesn't fit in the database, right? So you have to figure out a way to look at this at certain points in time and make sense out of that, right? Sort of draw the links. So what Prometheus does is it tracks and exposes metrics through instrumentation. It collects them and it stores them. And these metrics are what you're going to start querying. Sort of just like a database, except for it's a completely different kind of language, right? It's much more complicated than that. And you got to be able to visualize all this. So why are we looking at this? It's part of the CNCF, so it's definitely graduated and a mature thing. You will find this all over the place. I would be surprised if you walked into your ops departments if you didn't see them using some form of this somewhere. It's pretty much where everybody starts, of course, exploring metrics. It's really easy to get started with this. You're going to see if you do this workshop, it just comes up on your machine, or you install a container image and off and running. You know, he's already set up to self-scrape his own stuff. So it's like looking in its own pockets and things like that, right? It's open standards, and there's a little bit of a project going on right now where they're talking about looking at open standards or creating a standard for query language. So how we can, across traces, metrics, everything, standardize the query thing. Because there's several different things out there, and if anybody's using things like Datadog or whatever, proprietary stuff, they have their own language, so it's completely different when they query for metrics. This is the unofficial open standard inside of Prometheus for querying metrics. It's PromQL, Prometheus Query Language. So you'll see quite a bit of that in this. You'll have the endpoint discovery stuff that could be dynamic, or you have to configure it yourself, whichever you want to do. In my workshop so far, you're going to do it all by hand, which makes more sense so you can learn it. Auto stuff comes later. And there's a complete ecosystem of exporters. So I don't care what language, what apps, what things you're doing out there, there's a huge list of stuff. Somebody's already wrote it. You don't have to mess with it. You know? Just turn that on, they'll start doing stuff. This is what it looks like. It has its own little expression kind of console dashboard. We'll play around with this a little bit. You put a query in it. This is one of the metrics. You hit enter and it's showing you either a graph or a table view. If you're querying, a better example might have been to put the most basic query they have is up. Up is a metric that tells you what he's running, what he's detecting right now, what he's configured to look for, let's put it that way. So it's either going to say 1 or 0. So if it's up and running, that he's can find what he's supposed to query, it's up, otherwise it's down. One of the things I should say really quickly, you notice here it says 1 minute. Most of the time you're defaulting to an hour or a day or stuff like that, right? But remember when you're doing the workshop, you just turned this on. So you just turned on Prometheus, you just turned on the service demos and stuff that you're going to be tracking. So it's probably going to be really small over here and you're thinking this shit don't work because it's so small because you've only had it up for a minute. So just turn your time down to 5 minutes or whatever and you'll start seeing things up here, right? And not everything makes sense as a graph, so pay attention also in there about that too. So what does it not do? We mentioned metrics, right? It's very focused just on metrics. It doesn't do tracing and it doesn't do logs. What it also is a backend for other things you'll find out there, such as OpenTelemetry, which does do tracing and allows you to export to a backend in metric form. So you could have tracing metrics landing in your Prometheus time series database. Yeah. There's no machine learning or AI involved here whatsoever, unless you're saying into Google's or into that GTTP or whatever that thing's called. You're saying, well, what metric do I, you know, that kind of thing. And it's not very horizontally scalable or have cluster storage, which should set alarm bells off in your head already, and you already know what the last chapter is going to be about scaling this thing, right? So it only knows about itself. It only knows about its time series database. It only knows about what it queries, right? So if you put this in a Kubernetes area and it doesn't have auto discovery included in it and things start scaling up, it just doesn't even look at that. You know what I mean? It just doesn't happen. So the basic architecture, let's take a look at this. It has, its default is an in-memory time series database, so there is a limit out of the box of about 2 weeks of data. Depends upon what you're collecting, you know, if you're not going crazy. But that's usually where people start hitting the limit and start adding pieces to this, this architecture, right? It starts growing and becoming a problem. You'll have some kind of service out there that's being instrumented with a client library in this case. Have another one with an exporter that you're using, some third-party service, and a device you could be tagging, right? And what it's doing is, inside of here, he's scraping these, so you see that it's going out and getting them, so there's no impact on your application. You're not telling your application to push stuff. You're just telling him where he can find the application to go get it. And what that boils down to is you're turning on, these things are making sure that you're turning on an endpoint, basically a port. It's probably something pretty standard, but it turns on that port, you do /metrics by default, and you see everything you can query on that. And that's automatically exposed in that browser, expression browser you saw. So when you start typing one of those metrics, it shows you everything's possible. It's awesome, right? And then you have here service discovery, of course, where you can go out and get targets. It figures it out all by itself. And then what you want to do is start querying the Prometheus database to put up dashboards, because without dashboards, we don't know if my business is running. We don't know what's crashing. We don't know what's going on. So you got to figure out what's important to you and set up all these dashboards so that they're showing you what's important to you. Right? It's up to you to figure that out. And then you have an alert manager. That's a little engine in there that processes queries. So you write a bunch of rules and you say, if my CPU threshold gets above this high, send an alert. And then it's up to you to figure out, I didn't attach it, but it's too complicated. There it is. The email PagerDuty, I don't know what you're attaching on the back end, the Slack message, wake up that guy's beeper over there. That's basically what happens, right? The beeper goes off. So depending upon how you decided to configure it, but so that's how that works. It's not super complicated. So what do you get inside of the Prometheus? What does it give you? So we talked about the query language, and there's a dimensional data model. Now that sounds really creepy, doesn't it? It took me a long time to get my head around this. So everybody here understand Java and object-oriented programming? The concept anyway, even the managers? You have a person object, you have a name, an address, an age, a birthday. So these are labels. In metrics, you have the metric is the person, and the labels are the age and all this kind of stuff. They call this a four-dimensional metric, right? Each one of these labels is a dimension. So when they talk about the data model, you'll see a lot of references to dimensions. Kind of hate it because it's basically just labels, right? So how many labels has it got? You'll also hear a little bit about cardinality. That's just the same kind of mathematical term for a lot of dimensions. So what happens is people will design some kind of software that generates metrics. How many dimensions in those metrics is pretty damn crucial when you don't know what's going to happen when it hits your production site, right? And when it auto scales, then what? So now you're talking about cardinality explosions, right? Like you thought you added one app and maybe 15 metrics with some dimensions, and it turns out to be about 1 million dimensions in cardinality. So it gets really ugly really fast. Things crash and people don't know why. Time series processing, so integration of the metric time series data processing and alerting. So that's a big complicated way to talk about, hey, we can dashboard query this stuff, we can alert query this stuff, and make magic happen, right? You can see what's going on with all this stuff. Service discovery we already mentioned, and it's super, super efficient, right? My machine is not very hot. It's got 2 service demos running, it's got Prometheus running, and it's scraping away. Can you hear it? Talked about the dimensional data model. So over time, all kinds of stuff is happening, but how do you put this into a time series database, right? You basically cherry pick pieces out of it. And you see this is one series, and this is a different one with completely different time moments that I chose to pick. And he has the ability to store this stuff in a way that you can gather the information, all of it, based on just these points, right? So he's giving you a picture of what's happening, but he's making it possible to ingest this and possible to store this and possible to query this. There's no way your database would flood if you just streamed all this stuff straight into it, right? You just can't do that. It's just too much. If you want to see what a time series identifier looks like, so your metric is over here, and then it has labels with values. And each one of these values you already see are 2 things, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's not really crazy. It's just, it's not really nicely set up like a programming language, right? You're going to see when you query at the top line, as you type, you can put job in. It'll tell you what you're allowed to put into the job field, right? It's auto-completion, basically. It's like working in an IDE because he's collecting what he finds. And these are not predefined things. You've said maybe scrape this thing over there, and you might give it some custom labels, but generally speaking, it's pulling out what he gets from that client library from that thing. And so in this case, he says this thing has a job called API server, and this is the URL that you got to go to hit the API. That's what you decided to expose in this thing. So here's the metric name, as I already said, and those are the labels. So we already covered that. I got ahead of myself. So what does it look like in transit? It looks exactly like that. That's kind of funny because you can go to that URL with whatever port you exposed /metrics. So we did that really quickly, just for fun. Those are all the metrics that are being exposed. And I can already see that it's not happy. This has not got the right stuff in it, but we'll take care of that in a minute. There's a company out there from one of the founders called Promlabs. He has a bunch of education you could do around this stuff, and he also has a live server online that you can go look at the metrics and stuff that's just running all the time, doing some fake stuff just to give you something to query. So you can always use that as one of your endpoints. The Prometheus query language, yeah, that's very interesting stuff. So this is really something core that you're going to do a lot of when you're dealing with metrics and trying to put together dashboards and trying to figure out what's going on when something breaks, because you have to deviate off the dashboards, go to the command line tool and start digging around, right? It's a functional language, so it looks really complicated, but basically if you go all the way down to the inside, you evaluate the basic piece in the middle, which then feeds the next function outside, which feeds the next one, which feeds the next one. So most of what I'm going to show you is just one, right? It doesn't get very complicated. There is a standalone tool project called PromLens. It just got open sourced a couple months ago. It's a really nice tool to use. It's part of the workshop too. When you get to the advanced section, you'll install that and use that. That teaches you a lot about what's going on with your queries when you're trying to build them. So it automatically expands stuff out, automatically provides documentation and evaluates and explains to you, sort of like an AI kind of tool, right? Like, hey, this is what is going on here. So it's really nice for the understanding of what's going on. This is not easy stuff. I mean, these guys get a lot of money and have a lot of stress for a reason. This is the PromLens tool. You see that it's targeting something, and here is the query. And instead of just dumping things out into a graph, you can expand this out, and you can use an explain tab, which is an addition to explain what's going on. It's really kind of a fun tool to use. I'd pretty much recommend do it all the time. It's embedded into quite a few products, to be really honest, because it's a really quick shortcut to get a nice query thing. Time series processing. So what does this stuff look like, right? So this is the alert engine. This is just showing you a really quick view of what an alert is, right? So you see here there's some kind of alert based on, funny enough, it's based on a little bit of a query language thing. So what it's doing is parsing that and looking for something to hit a threshold. If it's greater than this 0.5 whatever for 10 minutes, then it's going to trigger something. That's what it looks like. It's not that complicated. So the modern infrastructure, of course, with service discovery is essential. You can't just be adding this stuff by hand. It gets out of control. We do 2 or 3 things, and already your configuration file is getting this big, right? That's not really how it works. So cloud environments, virtual machines, you need to have auto discovery. Otherwise, you won't be able to keep up. This is how this works. You have the service discovery, and there's lots of different things you can use for that. It's open source, so you can plug in a lot of different components, whatever works in your organization, right? Many times when you're thinking about doing something like this, they've already made choices in other areas of the architecture, right? So you're kind of stuck with that. And the target services, he'll go scrape all that stuff just like any other time. So it's very simple. It's written in Go, super efficient. There's no external runtimes needed or anything like that. It's just a precompiled binary if you're not running the container image. It's really straightforward. Yeah, not a lot to say about that. So when we get to a cloud native at scale, a little bit of the problem here is when you have 2 of them doing the same thing, they have no idea that the other one's there. So what do you think happens here? You're going to get multiple alerts, multiple rules firing, and he has no friggin' idea which one did it. He sees them each one as a unique thing and starts waking you up all the time, right? Goes crazy. That's a really, really hard thing to deal with. And realize, I'm only showing you like one piece here. I'm not showing you the dashboarding attached. I'm not showing you the database attached that you're eventually going to do. I'm not showing you the load balancing that gets involved in this. This gets really ugly really fast, and I cover that in that very last chapter. So when you get to the end, every lab will stop and say, this is what it should look like on your desktop usually, or explain what you just did. And then it'll say, here's some references you can go look at, points to the project, points to the workshop repository for this. Also a good tip if you're going to do this is just go check it out. This is a GitLab repository or a Git repository. You can check it out on your machine and just run it locally without having to go to this website. Same thing. I wrote a series of articles because I was basically an app dev guy until I joined this. So I had to take people on a journey over from what I used to talk about to what this stuff is about. And it's called Ollie Workshops. If you have any issues with anything in this, and if anybody's a Windows guy and can, some of these sub-projects and stuff, I have init scripts in them to automatically generate and do everything. And I've done attempts at a bat script, but no guarantees. So in the past, when I was doing this for JBoss stuff, it was always somebody out there would help me out with that stuff and send in a fix, and I'll put your name in there, and that's your first open source contribution, and it's really nice. I'll make you famous. I'll write an article about you. Okay? So please do that. That would be really fantastic for me anyway, and the rest of the world, and everybody gets a better system, right? You can always find me. That's how it ends up, and then we're off to the next one, right? But before we do that, I'm going to show you a little bit of some of the stuff you'll be doing later. And where are we? Here. So one of the things we did here, it's probably kind of small. Can you see that? Maybe I turn this just a wee bit so y'all can see. Can you see? Yeah. All right. Is it big enough? I'm not going to do anything with it, but basically what I've done is installed this project. You see there's an init script. This one doesn't even have an init bat. It's so easy, I think you can figure it out. It's just building the source and telling you how to kick it off. It's a services demo. If you just start it by default, it goes to port 8080/metrics. Now, because I saw that this thing wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, we're going to restart it. And then we're going to verify that it was doing what it's supposed to be doing. Where are we? Oh, that's probably why it wasn't. 8080/metrics. Ah, better. You see all this demo API stuff. These are just nothing but metrics, and these are the things he's doing. He's chasing down. And these are actual reported findings. So what it's telling you here, right here, is where in time it's happened. So that's where he found it. And this is an instant representation. So this is at that moment that I hit enter, these were the values he found. When you're doing dashboard and stuff like that, you're querying to a database. It's constantly adding these to the database, all those dots we saw along the line. And I want to get a representation in the graph. So he'll collect a bunch of them between a certain amount of time and start showing you what that is. So you can pick, for example, this metric, duration, seconds, buckets. So I think somewhere here I had it. There it is. It's huge. So just refresh it so it's there. So this is what it looks like when you come in, and you'll see if you start typing something. What was that again? You remember? Demo something buckets, API request duration. There you go, right there. And you'll notice he's even telling me what it's finding. It's either a counter or a gauge. Now a counter, what do you think a counter is? Yeah, not very exciting. It's like this, right? Or something that just fills up. Now a gauge is something completely different. That's a time series story, right? That's going to give you a nice graph. So you put a counter in a graph, what do you think is going to come out? Let's try it. Hit enter. And he found two things, right? When we look at the graph, well, this isn't a good example. Here, up. That's a better example. So up, what's up? We're tracking two services and Prometheus itself. That's just on or out. That's two values, right? So that's not a very interesting graph. It's a flat line. It's three lines right on top of each other. It's not very cool. And the other one we were just doing, that was a counter with a lot more interesting stuff going on. So demo, request, or API request buckets. And this changes through time, right? So if we go very small, it starts flattening out because it's not super interesting. But if you go longer, you're going to notice it's going to break, because this is when I was walking here. This was in the hotel room. This was probably back in Holland before I left this morning. And, sorry. Oops, too far. 1 day, 2 day. There you go. A week. You can see I was working this week on it, right? So you're going to find whatever data you scraped. If you have something at your work, which is kind of fun, you can point it at that. So if there's something that's scrapable, that recognizes this protocol and you can do that, that's way more fun. Right? Then you can go play with all kinds of fun stuff. And you get really interesting things. Let me go back to this. So we have one of those running here. We have another one that we started, and you see we added it to localhost 8080. or 8088, I'm sorry. It doesn't matter what you do in the workshop at this point. You can enter anything you want, whatever works on your machine. So if something's conflicting, just change it. Just recognize that later you're going to see images with 8088. Just change them to whatever you used. That makes most time makes sense. You'd be surprised how many people are like, it doesn't work because I used it. And I'm like, yeah, because I don't cover every possibility. So, and then once you get that done, you start Prometheus. But before we start Prometheus, we should look at what it looks like, right? Well, that's not going to be very nice. Yeah, I'll just do that. Probably better if I zoom it in a bit, huh? So this is a configuration for scraping. So basically we're saying a scrape interval, how often he's got to go out there and look. Every 5 seconds is pretty much default, but I put it in here for a reason. In real life, I don't know what you would put that at, probably closer to 30 seconds or something like that. The job name here is scrape configs are who I'm targeting, right? So here I'm doing Prometheus and the service demos. And you see here I've listed both of them, and here I've listed just the Prometheus one. This one's just because it comes out of the box, right? It's kind of an easy thing to do from the beginning. So you'll start with that, and then you'll start adding these things in. And then you're going to start adding tools to look at it from there. What you're also going to eventually do, we're going to do some expansion in this and add labels and all kinds of stuff you're going to add into this. So realize you're working from an actual configuration, but you can already feel it wouldn't be a lot of fun to have like 1,000 of these. It wouldn't be any fun to maintain, that's for sure. So auto discovery is probably a better way to go. But you see here, once you restart this, and off it goes. So any changes you make to that, you need to restart. And I teach you how to do that either by stopping and starting it. But if you do that, you're going to get a gap in your data. In real life, you don't want to do that. So what you tend to do is a kill -s hup. It's called a hup signal. In Unix, you send that thing and it just restarts the thing on the fly. Right? It doesn't cook it. So where are we at back here? So this is this thing. Are there any questions? Anything you want to see? Anything you're interested in? Or how far are we at? I haven't paid attention. Where are we at? 5 minutes? Oh, we got 5 minutes for questions? Anybody have any questions?